The music stopped first. Then the chatter died down to whispers. Finally, even the whispers faded to silence as every head in the stellar haven turned toward the entrance. The cantina's heavy blast doors had slid open with their usual hydraulic hiss, but what stepped through them was no ordinary patron looking for a drink and conversation. Vorth filled the doorway completely. At 12 feet tall, the Drakmori warrior had to duck slightly to avoid scraping his horned skull against the frame. His obsidian scales caught the dim lighting and threw it back in sharp reflections, each one polished to a mirror shine that spoke of pride and vanity. When he straightened to his full height inside the bar, his presence seemed to suck all the air from the room. The stellar haven had seen its share of dangerous customers. Pirates, smugglers, mercenaries, and worse had all passed through its doors seeking refuge in the neutral territory of the Outer Rim. But a Drakmori was different. They were apex predators from a world where everything had evolved to kill everything else. Their reputation preceded them across the galaxy like the smell of sulfur. Vorth's yellow eyes swept the room slowly, taking inventory of every species present. A table of saurian traders suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The crystalline quell beings in the corner booth dimmed their natural glow, hoping to avoid notice. Even the insectoid hive minds, usually fearless in groups, began shuffling toward the rear exit with nervous clicking sounds. The dragon-like alien's nostrils flared as he tasted the air. His forked tongue flicked out briefly, sampling the chemical signatures of fear and tension that now permeated the atmosphere. Good. Fear made prey easier to handle. It made them stupid and predictable. Behind the bar, the establishment's owner, a four-armed Deltan named Corso, slowly reached for the emergency beacon that would summon station security. His green skin had turned a pale shade that suggested serious concern about property damage. The Stellar Haven's insurance policy specifically excluded acts of war, and everyone knew that when a Drakmori entered a room, violence usually followed. Vorth noticed the movement and turned his massive head toward the bartender. His voice when he spoke was like gravel being crushed in a steel mill. Do not call security, Deltan. This is legal business under Galactic Commerce Code 779. I am here to collect a bounty. Corso's four hands froze. Bounty hunting was indeed legal in neutral space, but that did not make it any less dangerous for innocent bystanders. Who is your target, honored predator? Instead of answering immediately, Vorth began walking deeper into the cantina. His clawed feet left small gouges in the metal floor plating with each step. Other patrons scrambled to get out of his way, some abandoning their drinks entirely in their haste to reach the exits. The Drakmori's head swiveled left and right as he searched, and with each movement, more beings decided they had urgent business elsewhere. A human, Vorth said finally, his voice carrying easily through the now mostly empty space. Male, brown hair, approximately 6 feet in height. Goes by the name Dan. A few remaining patrons exchanged glances. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, considered too weak and fragile for the harsh realities of frontier life. Most galactic species viewed them as curiosities at best, suitable only for menial tasks on civilized worlds. The idea that one had warranted a bounty large enough to attract a Drakmori seemed almost absurd. What could a human possibly have done to merit your attention? Asked a brave Zentorian from near the back of the room. Vorth's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of teeth like obsidian daggers. The human has been accused of war crimes against the Drakmori Empire. The bounty is considerable, dead or alive, though dead would be simpler. At the far end of the bar, sitting alone on a stool with his back to the room, a figure in simple brown clothing continued nursing his drink. He had not moved when Vorth entered. He had not looked around when the other patrons fled. He simply sat there, occasionally lifting a glass of amber liquid to his lips. Vorth's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of ice clinking against glass. His nostrils detected the scent of ethanol mixed with something else, something organic and earthy. The human was drinking some primitive intoxicant, apparently unbothered by the chaos erupting around him. You, Vorth called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls. Human, turn around. The figure at the bar did not immediately comply. Instead, he took another sip of his drink and set the glass down carefully on the bar's surface. When he finally did turn, he moved slowly and deliberately, like someone who had all the time in the world. Dan looked exactly as described in the bounty posting. Average height for a human, brown hair that was starting to show gray at the temples, and unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd. He wore simple clothes that had seen better days and carried no visible weapons. Everything about him screamed ordinary except for his eyes. His eyes were calm and calculating, showing no fear despite facing a creature that could tear him apart with its bare claws. "Can I help you?" Dan asked in perfect galactic standard, his tone polite and conversational. Vorth felt a moment of confusion. Prey animals were supposed to run or cower when confronted by a predator. They were not supposed to sit calmly and ask if they could be of assistance. The human's behavior did not fit any pattern the Drakmori understood. "You are Dan, accused of crimes against the Drakmori Empire," Vorth stated, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I am here to collect the bounty on your head. You will come with me." Dan nodded thoughtfully as if considering a business proposition. "I see, and if I refuse?" "Then I will take your head anyway. The bounty is the same either way." The human took another sip of his drink and glanced around the now nearly empty cantina. A few brave souls remained in the shadows, too curious or too drunk to leave entirely. The bartender had wisely retreated to the far end of his establishment, ready to duck behind the bar at the first sign of violence. "Before we get to that," Dan said, turning back to face the Drakmori, "would you mind if I asked you a question?" Vorth's confusion deepened. This was not how these encounters typically went. Usually there was screaming, begging, or at least some attempt to flee. The human's composure was unsettling in a way the warrior could not quite identify. "Speak quickly," Vorth rumbled. "Have you ever heard of human military history?" Dan asked, his voice still calm and conversational. Vorth's massive frame shifted as he processed the human's strange question. Military history? What could this fragile creature possibly know about warfare that would interest a Drakmori warrior? The very notion was almost insulting. His claws extended slightly, scraping against the metal floor as he took a step closer to the bar. "Human military history is an oxymoron," Vorth replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your species has no natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced senses. You are soft-skinned prey animals that somehow convinced yourselves you could fight." Dan swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the ice cubes dance in the whiskey. The movement was hypnotic, almost meditative. Around them, the few remaining patrons pressed themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible while still maintaining a view of what promised to be either a very short fight or a very interesting conversation. "You might be surprised," Dan said quietly. "We humans have been at war with something or someone for most of our recorded history. Sometimes with each other, sometimes with our environment, sometimes with ideas that others found threatening." The Drakmori's laugh was like metal grinding against stone. Several pieces of glassware behind the bar vibrated sympathetically with the sound. "War? You call your primitive tribal conflicts war? I have studied your species as part of my bounty hunting research. You have no claws, no natural toxins, no psychic abilities. Your bones break easily. Your skin tears at the slightest pressure. And your reaction times are pathetically slow compared to any real predator species." Dan nodded agreeably, as if Vorth had just complimented his choice of beverage. "All true. We are remarkably fragile creatures when you think about it. No natural defenses to speak of. Most animals on our homeworld could kill us without much effort." He paused to take another sip. "That's probably why we got so good at killing them first." Something in the human's tone made Vorth pause. There was no bravado in the words, no attempt at intimidation. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the same casual air someone might use to discuss the weather. The Drakmori's enhanced senses detected no increase in the human's heart rate, no chemical markers of fear or stress. If anything, Dan seemed to be relaxing. "Your homeworld is classified as a low-threat environment in the Galactic database," Vorth said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Moderate gravity, abundant water, stable climate. It is practically a garden world." "Garden world," Dan repeated, chuckling softly. "I like that. Yes, Earth is quite beautiful. Lots of flowers and trees and scenic landscapes." He turned slightly on his stool to face the Drakmori more directly. "Of course, it's also home to creatures that can kill you with venom. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, radiation, extreme temperatures, toxic plants, predatory animals, and natural disasters that can level entire cities." Vorth's head tilted slightly, a gesture that indicated confusion among his species. "But the database clearly states that your world poses minimal risk to visiting species." That's because most visiting species stay in the safe zones we built for them, Dan explained. The tourist areas, the diplomatic quarters, the trade centers. We wouldn't want our guests to accidentally wander into a swamp full of alligators or step on a venomous snake or catch some disease that their immune systems can't handle. He smiled, and for the first time, there was something predatory in the expression. We learned long ago that it's much easier to control the environment than to change our nature. The Drakmori warrior found himself taking an unconscious step backward. There was something in the human's demeanor that triggered ancient instincts, warnings that predators learned to heed or die. But that was impossible. Humans were prey animals. The entire galactic community agreed on this point. You speak of control, Forth said, forcing confidence back into his voice. Yet your species has no significant military presence in this sector. No battle fleets, no fortress worlds, no warrior castes. How can you claim to be dangerous when you have no power? Dan finished his whiskey and set the empty glass on the bar with a soft clink. Power is an interesting concept. Most species think of it in terms of physical strength or advanced weapons or numerical superiority. But real power, lasting power, comes from being underestimated. The human stood up from his stool, and Vorth was surprised to note that the movement was fluid and controlled. There was no hesitation, no stiffness that might indicate hidden weapons or armor. Dan was exactly what he appeared to be. An ordinary middle-aged human in simple clothes, standing just under 6 feet tall and weighing perhaps 200 pounds. Next to Vorth's 12-foot frame and half-ton of muscle and bone, he looked like a child. "Let me ask you something," Dan said, clasping his hands behind his back in a casual pose. "When you studied my species for your bounty research, did you look into our mathematics?" "Mathematics?" Vorth's confusion was becoming more pronounced. "What does calculation have to do with combat?" "Everything," Dan replied simply. "We use mathematics to calculate trajectories for our weapons, optimal formations for our forces, supply requirements for extended campaigns, casualty ratios for different tactical approaches, probability matrices for strategic planning." He paused. "We've turned warfare into a science." The Drakmori's claws extended fully now, gleaming in the bar's dim lighting. This conversation was becoming uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. "Enough philosophy, human. You will come with me or I will take your corpse. The choice is yours." Dan looked around the cantina one more time, noting the positions of the remaining patrons, the exits, the improvised weapons within reach. His gaze lingered on a bottle of Altarian brandy behind the bar, its contents glowing faintly with bioluminescent additives. "Highly flammable," he noted absently. "Before we get to the violence," Dan said, turning back to face Vorth, "would you mind if I shared one more piece of human military history? Something I think you might find educational." "Speak quickly," Vorth growled, his patience exhausted. "During one of our larger conflicts, a human military leader was asked how many troops he would need to invade a heavily fortified enemy position. His response was interesting. He said he would need only 1 soldier. Dan smiled again, and this time the expression was definitely predatory. When asked how 1 soldier could possibly succeed where thousands might fail, he replied that the soldier wouldn't need to defeat the enemy. He would just need to teach them to defeat themselves. Vorth's roar of frustration shook dust from the ceiling. "Enough riddles. Face me, coward." The Drakmori lunged forward, plasma claws igniting with crackling energy that turned the air around them into superheated vapor. His movement was blindingly fast, covering the distance between them in less than a second. To any observer, it should have been over before it began, but somehow, impossibly, Dan was no longer where Vorth expected him to be. Dan rolled away from Vorth's charge, the plasma claws missing him by inches and carving deep gouges in the metal bar where he had been standing. The acrid smell of melted steel filled the air as the Drakmori spun around, his yellow eyes wide with surprise. Prey animals were not supposed to move that quickly or anticipate attacks with such precision. "Impressive reflexes," Dan commented, straightening his clothes as if he had simply stepped out of the way of a minor inconvenience. "Your species really is built for combat. Those claws could cut through most personal armor without much effort." Vorth snarled, positioning himself between Dan and the nearest exit. "Stop running, coward. Face me like a warrior." "I'm not running," Dan replied calmly, moving toward the center of the cantina where he would have more room to maneuver. "And I'm definitely not a warrior. I'm something much more dangerous than that." He gestured for Vorth to follow him. "I'm a human with a comprehensive education in military history." The Drakmori's confusion was growing by the second. Every instinct told him that he was facing a superior predator, but his eyes insisted he was looking at a fragile human who should have been dead already. The contradiction was maddening. "What are you?" Forth demanded, his claws crackling with barely contained energy. "I'm a teacher," Dan said, pulling a chair away from a nearby table and setting it between them like a barrier. "And since you're here to kill me anyway, I thought I might give you a lesson about why bounty hunters tend to avoid human targets." Dan began walking slowly around the improvised arena, keeping the furniture between himself and the increasingly agitated Drakmori. His movements were casual, almost lazy, but Forth noticed that the human was always positioned near potential weapons or escape routes. "Let's start with something simple," Dan continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of a lecture hall. "The Siege of Stalingrad 1942 to 1943 by our calendar. One human city, surrounded by enemy forces with superior numbers, better equipment, and more experience. The defenders should have surrendered within days." Vorth lunged again, this time trying to anticipate where Dan would move. But the human had already shifted position, using the chair as a springboard to vault over a table and land near the bar's collection of exotic beverages. Instead, Dan said, not even breathing hard, the humans chose to fight for every building, every room, every staircase. They turned their own city into a weapon against the invaders. When they ran out of ammunition, they used improvised explosives. When they ran out of explosives, they used knives and clubs and bare hands. The Drakmori's second attack had left him momentarily off balance, and Dan took advantage of the opportunity to grab a bottle of something that glowed with an ominous purple light. He held it casually as if it were just another prop for his lecture. "The siege lasted over 5 months," Dan continued. "By the end, both sides had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The city was completely destroyed. Most species would call it a draw, maybe even a defeat for the defenders." He smiled. "But it broke the back of the invasion force. They never recovered from the losses." Forth was beginning to understand that brute force alone would not work against this strange human. Dan moved like water, flowing around attacks rather than meeting them head-on. Every time the Drakmori thought he had cornered his prey, the human had already moved to a new position with better tactical advantages. "Another example," Dan said, tossing the glowing bottle from hand to hand with practiced ease. "The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. A technologically superior force invaded a human territory with better weapons, better training, better equipment, and more soldiers. This time when Vorth attacked, Dan threw the bottle directly at the Drakmori's face. Vorth's reflexes were fast enough to slash it out of the air with his claws, but the contents splashed across his scales and immediately began smoking. The alien alcohol was apparently corrosive to his particular biology. The defenders had none of those advantages," Dan continued, already moving toward another position. "What they did have was intimate knowledge of their terrain, willingness to accept massive casualties, and most importantly, the understanding that they didn't need to win every battle. They just needed to make victory too expensive for their enemies to sustain." Forth roared in pain and fury, wiping the burning liquid from his face. His vision was blurred, his scales stinging where the alcohol had made contact. This was not how predator-prey encounters were supposed to unfold. The prey was supposed to run until caught, then die quickly and efficiently. 20 years, Dan said, his voice still calm despite the fact that he was facing a wounded and increasingly desperate alien warrior. 20 years of fighting. The invaders had air superiority, naval superiority, technological superiority, and they still lost. Do you know why? Dan had positioned himself near a table full of abandoned drinks and food. Without breaking eye contact with Vorth, he began collecting items that caught his interest. A salt shaker, a small bottle of hot sauce, a metal utensil with a sharp edge. "They lost because humans don't fight fair," Dan explained. "We don't have honor codes that prevent us from using dirty tactics. We don't have religious prohibitions against certain types of weapons. When we're threatened, we use everything available to us, including things that our enemies never considered to be weapons." Vorth charged again, this time trying to overwhelm Dan with pure speed and aggression, but the human had anticipated the attack, diving under a table and kicking it upward as the Drakmori passed overhead. The heavy furniture caught Vorth in the midsection, sending him crashing into the wall with enough force to crack the metal plating. "The War of 1812, Dan continued, emerging from under the table with his improvised weapons collection. Humans fighting other humans for control of territory. Both sides use similar tactics at first, meeting in open fields, fighting according to established rules of engagement. Dan shook the contents of the salt shaker into his palm, then mixed it with the hot sauce to create a paste that seemed to writhe with its own chemical reactions. The mixture gave off a pungent smell that made even the distant alien observers cover their breathing apparatus. But then one side started using guerrilla tactics, Dan said, spreading the mixture on the sharp utensil. Ambushes, sabotage, attacking supply lines instead of armies. The other side called it dishonorable, unsporting against the rules of civilized warfare. Vorth struggled to his feet, his scales scraped and bleeding where he had hit the wall. The impact had been harder than expected, and his inner ear was still ringing from the collision. Worse, the humans seemed to be growing more confident with each exchange, while Vorth felt increasingly out of his depth. The side using guerrilla tactics won, Dan concluded, testing the weight of his improvised weapon. Not because they were stronger or better equipped, but because they understood something their enemies didn't. There are no rules in a fight for survival. There are only winners and losers. The Drakmori warrior found himself backing away from the seemingly harmless human, every predatory instinct screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. Dan looked exactly the same as when Vorth had first entered the cantina. Same simple clothes, same unremarkable appearance, same calm demeanor. But now there was something else, something that had been hidden beneath the surface. Last lesson, Dan said, beginning to circle Vorth like a predator stalking wounded prey. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945. The largest military conflict in human history. Over 70 million casualties. Entire cities destroyed. Weapons that could level mountains. Dan's movements had changed subtly. Where before he had seemed casual and relaxed, now there was a coiled tension in his posture, like a spring compressed to its breaking point and ready to release devastating energy. By the end of that war, Dan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, we had created weapons that could destroy entire planets. Not conquer them, not occupy them. Destroy them completely, making them uninhabitable for thousands of years. Vorth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cantina's climate control. That's impossible. No species would create such weapons. Dan smiled, and for the first time since the encounter began, the expression held no warmth whatsoever. We didn't just create them. We used them twice on our own planet, against our own species. The silence that followed was deafening. The revelation hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Vorth's mind struggled to process what the human had just admitted. Using planet-destroying weapons against their own species was beyond any concept of warfare that the Drakmori understood. It violated every principle of survival that evolution had taught them. You're lying, Vorth said, but his voice lacked conviction. Something in Dan's calm certainty suggested that this was not bluff or intimidation. It was simply fact, stated as casually as one might mention the weather. Nuclear weapons, Dan said, still circling with that predatory grace that seemed so wrong coming from such an ordinary-looking creature. Atomic bombs. Hydrogen bombs. We've built thousands of them over the years. Some of our nations still maintain arsenals large enough to sterilize entire star systems. Dan paused near a broken piece of furniture, testing its weight and balance. The jagged edge of a table leg caught his attention, and he picked it up with the same casual interest a chef might show when selecting a knife. The beautiful thing about mutually assured destruction, Dan continued, is that it teaches restraint. When everyone has the power to end civilization, people become very careful about how they conduct their disagreements. Vorth's patience finally snapped. The constant talking, the casual movement, the complete lack of proper prey behavior had pushed him beyond his limits. With a roar that shattered several glasses behind the bar, he launched himself at Dan with every ounce of speed and strength he possessed. This time, Dan did not dodge. Instead, he stepped forward to meet the charge, moving inside Vorth's reach where the long claws could not be brought to bear effectively. The improvised club in his hand swung in a short, vicious arc that caught the Drakmori across the side of his skull with the sound of a sledgehammer hitting stone. Vorth staggered, his vision blurring from the unexpected impact. How had such a small creature generated enough force to actually hurt him? Before he could recover, Dan was moving again, staying close where the Drakmori's size worked against him. The table leg struck again, this time targeting the nerve cluster behind Vorth's left knee. The Drakmori's leg buckled, sending him crashing into a row of chairs that splintered under his weight. Dan followed the attack with the salt and hot sauce mixture, flinging it directly into Vorth's eyes. The chemical burn was immediate and agonizing. Vorth clawed at his face, temporarily blinded and in more pain than he had ever experienced. His enhanced senses, usually such an advantage, now worked against him as the acidic mixture triggered every nerve ending in his optical cavity. Pain compliance techniques, Dan explained in that same lecture hall tone, though now there was an edge to his voice that spoke of controlled violence barely held in check. Humans developed extensive research into how to cause maximum discomfort with minimum permanent damage. Very useful for interrogation and prisoner control. Vorth swung wildly with his claws, hoping to catch the human by luck, if not by skill. But Dan had already moved, keeping just out of reach while the Drakmori exhausted himself with blind attacks. When Vorth finally paused to try to clear his vision, Dan struck again. This time the target was Vorth's wrist, where the human had somehow identified a pressure point that sent shooting pain up the alien's entire arm. The plasma claw in that hand flickered and died as nerve signals failed to reach the bioelectric generators. Anatomy studies, Dan noted, circling around to Vorth's blind side. Every species has vulnerable points if you know where to look. Nerve clusters, circulatory choke points, joint weaknesses. We've made a science of finding them. Vorth spun around, trying to track the human by sound alone, but Dan moved with a silence that seemed impossible for a creature wearing hard-soled shoes on metal flooring. The next attack came from a completely unexpected direction. Another precise strike to a nerve center that sent Vorth's right leg into involuntary spasms. Stealth techniques borrowed from our natural predators, Dan continued, now sounding almost conversational. Humans aren't naturally quiet, so we studied the creatures that were. Big cats, certain birds, some reptiles. We learned how they moved, how they breathed, how they used their environment to mask their presence. The Drakmori was beginning to panic. This was not combat as he understood it. There was no honor in this, no test of strength or skill. Dan fought like a disease, striking at vulnerabilities and weaknesses with surgical precision, always staying just out of reach of retaliation. "Fight me properly," Vorth roared, his remaining plasma claw carving glowing furrows in the air. "Stand and face me like a warrior." "I told you," Dan replied from somewhere behind him. "I'm not a warrior. I'm something much worse." A heavy glass ashtray hurled with perfect accuracy caught Vorth in the back of the head. The impact sent him stumbling forward, directly into a support beam that he struck with bone-jarring force. Before he could recover, Dan was there with another improvised weapon. This one a broken bottle that had been modified into a crude but effective cutting tool. The jagged glass found gaps in Vorth's natural armor, drawing thin lines of blood that burned with whatever chemical Dan had coated the improvised blade with. The cuts were not deep enough to be permanently damaging, but they hurt far more than they should have, and they seemed to interfere with Vorth's natural healing responses. Psychological warfare, Dan explained, staying just close enough to maintain pressure without exposing himself to effective counterattack. Most species fight until they're physically unable to continue. Humans fight until their enemies lose the will to continue. There's a significant difference. Vorth tried to grab his tormentor, but Dan flowed around the attempt like water, somehow managing to strike 2 more nerve clusters in the process. The Drakmori's left arm went completely numb, hanging uselessly at his side. Pressure point manipulation combined with chemical enhancement, Dan noted clinically. The numbness should last about 20 minutes, assuming your nervous system processes toxins at roughly the same rate as most carbon-based life forms. The alien warrior found himself backed against the bar, his vision still blurred, one arm useless, both legs barely supporting his weight. Dan stood just out of reach, not even breathing hard despite the intense physical activity. Worse, the human's clothes were barely rumpled, as if this had been nothing more than a mild exercise. "How?" Vorth gasped, genuine bewilderment cutting through his pain and rage. "You have no natural weapons, no enhanced strength, no armor. How are you doing this?" Dan picked up another bottle from behind the bar, examining its contents with professional interest. "Tool use," he said simply. "Humans are very good at making tools. We've been doing it for millions of years. Everything around us becomes a potential weapon if we need it to be." As if to demonstrate, Dan showed Vorth how a simple drinking straw could be turned into a dart by the addition of a small weight and some creative origami. The improvised projectile, when thrown properly, could strike with enough force to penetrate soft tissue. Adaptability, Dan continued, setting up his next demonstration. Most species develop one effective fighting style and stick with it. Humans change tactics constantly. Sometimes in the middle of a single encounter, we use whatever works, then move on to something else before our enemies can adapt. Vorth made one last desperate attempt to end the fight, lunging forward with his remaining functional claw extended. But Dan had anticipated the move, stepping aside and using Vorth's own momentum against him. The Drakmori found himself flying through the air, crashing into a pile of furniture that had been strategically positioned to maximize the impact. When the dust settled, Vorth lay tangled in broken chairs and table legs, his remaining plasma claw flickering weakly before finally dying completely. He tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. The human's precise attacks had left him physically capable of life but incapable of further combat. Dan approached slowly, carrying a length of cable he had somehow procured from the cantina's infrastructure. His movements were still calm and controlled, showing no signs of fatigue or stress from the encounter. "Restraint techniques," Dan said, beginning to secure Vorth's limbs with practiced efficiency. "Non-lethal combat methods. Humans excel at defeating enemies without killing them, though we're perfectly capable of lethality when the situation requires it." As the cable tightened around his wrists and ankles, Vorth felt the last of his strength drain away. He had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior intelligence applied with ruthless efficiency. "Now then," Dan said, settling into a chair where he could keep an eye on his prisoner, "I believe we were discussing the bounty on my head." Vorth lay bound on the floor of the cantina, his massive frame reduced to helpless immobility by simple cable and human ingenuity. The chemical burns around his eyes had begun to subside, allowing him to see clearly for the first time since the fight began. What he saw confused him almost as much as his defeat had. Dan sat in a chair a few feet away, looking exactly as he had when Vorth first entered the establishment. His clothes were slightly disheveled, but otherwise he appeared completely unharmed. More disturbing still, he had produced a small medical kit from somewhere and was carefully cleaning and bandaging the minor cuts he had inflicted on the Drakmori during their encounter. "Why are you treating my wounds?" Vorth asked, his voice hoarse from roaring. The question came out before he could stop it, born of genuine bewilderment. Dan looked up from his work, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because causing unnecessary suffering serves no tactical purpose. I needed to defeat you, not torture you." The concept was alien to Vorth. In Drakmori culture, defeated enemies were either killed quickly or left to suffer as an example to others. The idea of providing medical care to someone who had just tried to kill you was incomprehensible. "I don't understand your species," Vorth admitted, wincing as Dan applied some kind of antiseptic to a particularly deep cut. "You fight like a demon, then show mercy like a saint. What are you?" "Practical," Dan replied, returning to his work. "Revenge feels good in the moment, but it rarely serves long-term strategic interests. Dead enemies can't provide information or change their allegiances. Grateful enemies sometimes become valuable allies." Dan finished his medical ministrations and returned to his chair, pulling out a small electronic device that Vorth recognized as a standard galactic communication unit. He began entering commands with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. "Now about that bounty," Dan said, not looking up from the device. "I'm curious about the specific charges against me. War crimes is a rather broad category." Vorth felt a chill that had nothing to do with his injuries. The human's tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was an undertone that suggested Dan already knew the answer to his question. This was not an interrogation, but a test. The charges include illegal use of unconventional weapons, violation of the Galactic Warfare Convention, and genocide against Drakmori colonial forces, Vorth recited from memory. "The bounty was posted by the Drakmori High Command as justice for your crimes." Dan nodded slowly, still working on his communication device. "Interesting. And when did these alleged crimes take place?" 18 months ago in the Kepler 442 system, Vorth replied automatically. "You advised the local coalition forces in their resistance against our expansion efforts." "Expansion efforts," Dan repeated, finally looking up from his device. "That's an interesting way to describe the systematic bombardment of civilian population centers." The words hit Vorth like a physical blow. How could the human know about the bombardments? That information was classified at the highest levels of Drakmori military intelligence. Dan seemed to read the confusion on Vorth's face. I was there, he said simply. Not as a military advisor, at least not initially. I was part of a humanitarian mission, trying to evacuate refugees from the war zone. The human stood and began pacing around the cantina, his movements casual but his voice taking on a harder edge. 3 colonies, Vorth. 3 entire worlds with a combined population of nearly 40 million sentient beings. Your high command decided they were too expensive to conquer conventionally, so they chose a different approach. Dan stopped near the bar and poured himself another whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light as it filled the glass. Orbital bombardment of population centers, poisoning of water supplies, release of biological weapons specifically designed to target non-Drakmori species. Very efficient, very cost-effective, and completely illegal under every galactic treaty ever signed. Vorth felt his world tilting on its axis. The expansion into the Kepler 442 system had been presented to the general population as a glorious military campaign against hostile alien forces. The details Dan was describing sounded like atrocities, not legitimate warfare. You're lying, Vorth said, but his voice lacked conviction. The Drakmori Empire doesn't target civilians. We're honorable warriors. Dan laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Honorable warriors don't use nerve gas on refugee camps. They don't poison agricultural areas to create artificial famines. They don't systematically execute prisoners of war. The human pulled up a holographic display from his communication device, showing what appeared to be official Drakmori military documents. Vorth recognized the formatting and security encryption immediately, which meant these were genuine intelligence files. I have the complete operational records, Dan said, scrolling through page after page of damning evidence. Orders from your high command, casualty reports, even video recordings of some of the worst atrocities. Everything your forces did in that system is documented in excruciating detail. Vorth stared at the documents, his mind reeling. The orders were genuine, bearing the seals and signatures of the highest-ranking military officials in the Empire. Worse, the casualty numbers were staggering. Millions of civilians killed not in crossfire or collateral damage, but in deliberate targeting operations. How did you get those files? Vorth whispered. The coalition forces asked for help after their conventional defenses failed, Dan explained, continuing to scroll through the documentation. They were facing extinction, and they were willing to try anything to save their people. So they contacted Earth. Dan turned the display so Vorth could see it more clearly. We sent a small team of military advisors to assess the situation. When we realized what your forces were actually doing, we had a choice. We could follow proper diplomatic channels, file protests with the Galactic Council, and watch while 40 million beings were slaughtered, or we could do something about it. The next set of documents showed detailed tactical analyses, supply line assessments, and strategic recommendations that bore Dan's electronic signature. Vorth recognized the methodology immediately, the same systematic approach that had led to his own defeat. Unconventional weapons, Dan continued. Your charges are technically correct. We taught the coalition forces how to build improvised explosive devices using common industrial chemicals. We showed them how to hack into Drakmori communication networks and feed false information to your commanders. We helped them turn their own infrastructure into weapons against your invasion force. Vorth watched in growing horror as Dan displayed the results of those tactics. Drakmori supply convoys destroyed by roadside bombs, communications networks compromised, leading to friendly fire incidents and confused troop movements. Entire battalions led into carefully prepared kill zones where the defenders held every advantage. The Galactic Warfare Convention, Dan said, his voice growing colder. Yes, we violated it. Repeatedly and deliberately. Because your forces violated it first, and the Council was too slow and too bureaucratic to do anything about genocide in real time. The final set of documents showed the aftermath. Drakmori casualties in the tens of thousands, colonial expansion efforts abandoned, 3 worlds saved from extinction, their populations alive and rebuilding. The genocide charges are my personal favorite, Dan said, his smile returning but holding no warmth. Because it's true. We did commit genocide in that system. We systematically destroyed every single Drakmori military unit, every command structure, every weapons depot, and every strategic asset. Dan leaned forward, his eyes meeting Vorth's directly. What we didn't do was harm a single Drakmori civilian. Every attack was precisely targeted at military assets. Every casualty was a combatant engaged in the systematic murder of defenseless populations. The silence stretched between them as Vorth tried to process the implications of what he had learned. Everything he thought he knew about the conflict, about his own military, about the nature of honor and warfare itself, had been turned upside down. The bounty wasn't posted by your high command for justice, Dan said finally. It was posted by the private contractors who were profiting from the war. When we ended the conflict too quickly and too decisively, they lost billions of credits in potential earnings. Dan finished his whiskey and set the glass aside. War profiteers, Vorth. They don't care about honor or justice or the survival of civilizations. They care about keeping conflicts going as long as possible to maximize their profits. Vorth felt something inside him break, not his bones or his body which were already damaged, but something deeper, his faith in his own culture, his understanding of his place in the galaxy, his very identity as a Drakmori warrior. What am I supposed to do with this information? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dan stood and began gathering his belongings, preparing to leave. That's up to you. You can continue hunting humans for bounties and eventually face the consequences when you push us too far, or you can help me do something about the real problem. The human paused at the cantina's entrance, looking back at the bound Drakmori warrior. Your choice, Vorth, but choose quickly. I have a feeling this conversation is about to become much more complicated. Dan reached for the cable binding Vorth's wrists but stopped when he heard the familiar hum of approaching hover vehicles outside the cantina. The sound was distinctive, the low-frequency throb of military-grade anti-gravity engines designed for rapid deployment of armed forces. Faster than I expected, Dan murmured, checking his communication device. It seems someone was monitoring our conversation. Vorth struggled to sit up, his confusion growing by the second. What are you talking about? Who's coming? Drakmori enforcement squads, most likely, Dan replied, moving to a window and peering through the reinforced glass. 3 assault shuttles, full combat loadout. Someone really doesn't want us to continue this discussion. The bound warrior felt his blood turn to ice. Drakmori enforcement squads were not sent to collect bounties or conduct arrests. They were sent to eliminate problems that threatened the Empire's stability. Problems like military officers who had learned too much about classified operations. They're not here for you, Vorth said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. They're here for me, Dan nodded grimly. The moment you started viewing those classified documents, your communication implant transmitted your location and biometric data to Empire security. They know you've been exposed to information that could destabilize their carefully constructed narrative about the Kepler 442 operations. Outside, the sound of boots on metal indicated that the enforcement squads were deploying around the cantina. These were not ordinary Drakmori soldiers, but elite units trained specifically to handle situations that required absolute discretion and permanent solutions. You planned this, Vorth accused, but there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of resigned admiration. You knew they would come. I suspected they might, Dan admitted, pulling a small device from his pocket that looked like nothing more than a standard emergency beacon. The question is what you want to do about it. Vorth tested his bonds and found them still secure. Even if Dan released him immediately, he was in no condition to fight his way through a squad of elite warriors. His injuries from their earlier encounter had left him barely mobile, and his weapon systems were completely drained. What choice do I have? He asked bitterly. I'm bound, wounded, and facing execution by my own forces. This seems like an excellent day to die. Dan activated the small device in his hand, and Vorth was surprised to see it project a complex holographic interface that definitely did not belong to any standard emergency beacon. You have exactly the same choice I offered you earlier. Die here as a victim of circumstances beyond your control, or live to help me fix the problem. The first explosion came from the cantina's rear entrance, followed immediately by the crash of heavily armed Drakmori warriors, forcing their way through reinforced barriers. Their plasma weapons were already charged, and their combat armor bore the distinctive markings of the Empire's most elite units. Dan Torres, the squad leader, called out, his voice amplified by external speakers. By order of the Drakmori High Command, You will surrender immediately for crimes against the Empire. Dan raised his hands in apparent surrender, but Vorth noticed that the human's fingers were still moving across the holographic interface of his mysterious device. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Dan called back. I'm not the person you're looking for. Identify yourself, the squad leader demanded, moving deeper into the cantina with his weapon trained on Dan. Dr. Daniel Torres, senior military advisor to the Terran Colonial Defense Force, Dan replied calmly, and as of 3 minutes ago officially attached to the human embassy under full diplomatic immunity. The squad leader paused, confusion evident even through his combat helmet. There is no human embassy in this sector. Dan smiled, and this time the expression held genuine amusement. There is now. The holographic display from Dan's device suddenly expanded, filling the center of the cantina with an official document bearing the seals of both the Galactic Council and the United Nations of Earth. The document was a formal declaration of diplomatic status, complete with authentication codes and legal precedents. Diplomatic immunity was granted under emergency provisions after evidence of war crimes was presented to the Council, Dan explained, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone reading legal documents. As the primary witness in an ongoing investigation, I am now under the protection of international law. The enforcement squad leader's weapon wavered as he tried to process this unexpected development. War crimes investigations involving diplomatic immunity were far beyond his operational parameters, and engaging a protected witness could have catastrophic consequences for the Empire's standing in the galactic community. That document is a forgery, the squad leader said, but his voice lacked conviction. Feel free to verify it with Council headquarters, Dan suggested helpfully. The authentication codes should clear within the next few minutes. While the Drakmori warriors were distracted by the legal implications of the situation, Dan moved quickly to Vorth's side and began cutting through the cable bindings. The bound warrior looked up at him in surprise. What are you doing? Vorth whispered. Recruiting, Dan replied quietly. You have about 30 seconds to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The squad leader's communication equipment crackled to life as responses began coming in from Empire headquarters. The authentication codes were legitimate. The diplomatic status was real. Worse still, the Galactic Council had already begun issuing subpoenas for high-ranking Drakmori officials to testify about the Kepler 4E42 operations. This is impossible, the squad leader snarled. How did you arrange diplomatic immunity so quickly? Dan helped Vorth to his feet, supporting the injured warrior as he struggled to regain his balance. Time zones, he explained conversationally. While we were having our discussion here, it was business hours on Earth and at Council headquarters. I filed the paperwork during our fight. Vorth stared at the human in amazement. Dan had been simultaneously fighting for his life and conducting complex diplomatic negotiations through his communication device. The level of multitasking required was almost incomprehensible. Your warrior friend there poses an interesting problem, Dan continued, addressing the squad leader directly. According to Empire regulations, he's now a security risk who has been exposed to classified information. Your orders are probably to eliminate him along with me. The squad leader's hesitation confirmed Dan's assessment. Vorth felt a chill as he realized that his own government had indeed sent these forces to kill him, as well as the human. However, Dan said, his voice taking on the tone of someone proposing a business deal, I have a counter-offer that might interest your superiors. Dan activated another function of his communication device, this time projecting a star chart that showed the current political situation in the local galactic sector. Red zones marked areas of Drakmori influence, while green zones indicated territories aligned with the growing human-led coalition. Your empire is facing a choice, Dan explained. Continue the current path of expansion through military force and eventually face coordinated resistance from an alliance that now includes most of the major powers in this region. Or negotiate a new arrangement that allows for peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit. The display showed trade routes, resource allocations, and economic projections that painted a picture of potential prosperity, far exceeding what military conquest could provide. The numbers were compelling even to a warrior mindset focused primarily on territorial acquisition. The humans offer alliance rather than domination, Dan continued. Shared technology, open trade, joint exploration of uncolonized systems. All we ask in return is an end to the systematic elimination of civilian populations and adherence to established galactic law. Forth found his voice at last. And if the Empire refuses? Dan's smile became predatory again. Then they face the same fate as every other aggressive expansionist power in human history. Complete strategic defeat, followed by occupation and reconstruction under international supervision. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Dan had used throughout their encounter, but its implications were staggering. The human was calmly threatening to wage war against one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. "You're bluffing," the squad leader said, but his weapon remained lowered. "Humans don't have the military strength to challenge the Empire." "Don't we?" Dan asked, activating one final display that showed the true extent of human presence in the galaxy. The star chart revealed dozens of established colonies, hidden military installations, and alliance agreements that had been carefully concealed from galactic intelligence networks. The scope of human expansion was far beyond what any species had suspected. "We've been preparing for this conversation for quite some time," Dan admitted. "Every species that has chosen aggression over cooperation has eventually learned the same lesson. Humans are very good at two things: making friends and eliminating enemies. We strongly prefer the first option." Forth looked at the evidence of human power projection and felt a paradigm shift that was almost physical in its intensity. Everything he had believed about the balance of power in the galaxy was wrong. The humans were not weak prey animals struggling for survival. They were apex predators who had been hiding their true strength until it was needed. "What happens now?" Forth asked. Dan shut down his communication device and looked directly at the enforcement squad leader. "Now you take a message back to your superiors. The war crimes investigation proceeds under galactic law, and the individuals responsible for the Kepler 442 atrocities face justice. In exchange, the Empire receives an offer of alliance and partnership in building a more stable galactic civilization." The squad leader remained motionless for a long moment, processing the implications of everything he had witnessed. Finally, he lowered his weapon completely and activated his own communication system. "Command, this is Strike Leader Corex," he said. "Mission parameters have changed. Requesting immediate consultation with High Command regarding diplomatic developments." Dan nodded approvingly. "Excellent choice. Tell them they have 72 hours to respond before the offer expires, and we move to more direct methods of problem resolution." As the enforcement squad began withdrawing from the cantina, Forth found himself standing beside the human who had completely altered his understanding of the universe. "What about me?" he asked. "That depends," Dan replied. "Are you interested in helping build something better than what currently exists, or do you prefer the old system of might makes right?" Forth looked around the damaged cantina, thinking about everything he had learned and everything he had lost in the span of a single conversation. His faith in his government was gone, his certainty about his place in the galaxy was shattered, and his assumptions about human weakness had been thoroughly disproven. But for the first time in his life, he could see a path forward that didn't depend on conquest and domination, a future where strength served justice rather than the other way around. "I think," Forth said slowly, "that I would like to learn more about human history." Dan smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth. "Excellent. I know just the place to start." Together they walked out of the stellar haven and into a galaxy that would never be quite the same again.